Welcome back. This is week 9, lecture 2, from the Edict of Worms to the Confession of Augsburg. And here I want to, in this lecture, step back a bit and look at some of the political developments between Luther's condemnation at the Edict of Worms in 1521, in May, June of 1521, and the decision of the Reichstag, led by Emperor Charles V, that Luther should be condemned. The bull of excommunication should be in effect, that Luther should be captured and sent to Rome to be tried for heresy. His books, all of his writings, should be confiscated and burned. That's essentially what the Edict of Worms stated. And we've already talked about how Frederick the Wise then kidnapped Luther on his way back to Wittenberg and whisked him off to his castle in the Wartburg, protecting Luther thereby. Now, I don't think there'll be much new to this lecture. There could be, I'm not sure. I don't remember everything I've said along the way. But I think most of today's lecture refers to events and developments that I have mentioned before in passing or in pointing to what was coming in the future from where I was. But I think it's important to kind of put it all together on a political basis to see what the political situation within the empire was that led to as we'll see eventually, what's known as the Schmalkaldic Wars, but which were essentially a civil war in Germany and within the empire. We talk, and there's a later lecture on the so-called religious wars in France, which was a civil war in France between the Protestants, known as the Huguenots, and the Catholics, led by the king. That's a fun story in and of itself that we'll get to. But here, almost 30 years before the French wars of religion, we have wars of religion within the empire. And it was a civil war between the Protestant princes, or what were to become the Protestant princes, as all dressed today, and cities against the Catholic princes and cities led by the emperor. So this is really a fantastic development, essential for our understanding of what this thing we call the Reformation was and how it was developing and the impact that it was to have as it continued to develop. And it's really we see the breaking apart of Christendom in this period. Now, I've talked about the crumbling of Christendom and the crisis of the later Middle Ages and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, where the cracks and fissures were becoming more widespread and more evident to people everywhere. But it's really as a result, not so much of Luther and his theological positions, but what those positions and the Luther controversy that all started as a controversy with indulgences, what it unleashed and what came about as a result. And that's what we're looking at today in kind of broad strokes. So to do so, we return to a scene that I know I've mentioned before. I just was talking about it, and that is the Edict of Worms. And to approach this, we have to realize what was going on here. Luther had already been excommunicated by the papacy. He was supposed to have been handed over to Rome. His writings were supposed to have been confiscated and burned. And there was sufficient political pressure on Charles V, who, keep in mind, was now 21 years old, not to do so. To say, look, Charles, this is a German issue. We should deal with it here. Don't let the Italians step in and interfere with imperial politics. Don't let the Pope determine what the imperial politics should be. Let's deal with this on our own, and then we can go from there and deal with the Pope one way or the other. So let's treat this problem that we're having of the next imperial diet, the meeting of the Reichstag, the imperial legislature. And that was what Worms in 1521. And that they did. And they brought Luther, who was trepidatious. He knew the story of Huss. He had already by this time had his discovery that he was a Hussite, and so was Staupitz, and so was St. Paul and St. Augustine as well. They all were Hussites, according to Luther. He knew the papacy in his mind was the Antichrist, not just the Pope as an individual. He could still write somewhat differentially to Pope Leo in these two letters. One, when he claims that he will accept Leo's voice as a voice of Christ speaking through him. The next letter he writes to Leo after 1520 in this discovery is still saying, hey, your Holiness, Pope Leo, buddy, look, you're in deep trouble, man. Did you really? He doesn't come out and say it quite, saying as the papacy is the Antichrist, but he talks about the evilness of all the Pope Leo's advisors, of the institution, and he's concerned for Leo as an individual. Now, that letter itself is an indication that Luther's discovery was not so much that Leo was the Antichrist, as had been the accusations brought by Louis of Bavaria and his group and his followers against Pope John the 22nd. That was very much that John the 22nd is the Antichrist. But with Luther, it's different. It's that the papacy is. And I know I've stressed that before, but I think it bears repeating because that is an important, essential point for understanding Luther's reaction. Now, Charles said, okay, we'll deal with it here in Germany. At Worms, we'll bring Luther in. We'll ask him to talk to us, tell us what he thinks, and tell us what he will recant, if anything. I've already gone through that scene, that event, where Luther asked if he could go through all of his works kind of line by line, and he said there's certainly some things he probably would be willing to recant, whereas others not, unless he could be convinced by Scripture. I've talked about that stance. Number one, also his appeal to conscience, saying there would be a sin to go against his conscience, which is a medieval position to take, traditional medieval psychology and moral theology that he was appealing to. But he wasn't given the opportunity to do that. They said, no, all or nothing. Do you recant everything you've published and written? And Luther said, no, I can't. I cannot, in good conscience, do that unless I can go through and point to, statements maybe I made that I overspoke or was too critical or something like that. That I could come back and we can deal with that. But no, if you just say all or nothing, then it's nothing because I stand by many of the things I say. Now, think of the drama. It would be like Luther standing before a joint session of Congress presided over by the President of the United States. Now, obviously, it's different, but that is the import of this meeting. It was a political meeting. It's a political legislature led by the emperor, who was in attendance, and they made their decision. I think I've already mentioned that Charles's view was, how can you, Martin, a single individual, be right in 1,000 years of church tradition, of Christian tradition, be wrong? Therefore, you are condemned. The excommunication will be enforced. You will be handed over to Rome. Your books will all be confiscated and burned. You'll be tried for a heretic in Rome. And then Frederick kidnapped him. That posed a dilemma for not only Frederick, but anyone else who was supporting Luther. And there were already other princes, Philip of Hesse being one of the primary ones. Hesse's in central Germany. And Philip of Hesse was not one of the electors, but he was one of the major princes of the empire. But he wasn't the only one. And there were some cities too by this time already. Zurich hadn't quite changed, introduced the Reformation yet, but they're getting close. There were sentiments all around. Shortly after Luther was kidnapped, I've already talked about the Wittenberg movement that was going on there, that was the catalyst for Luther daring to return to Wittenberg to restore order. And the problem, in some ways, that Charles faced was that once the Edict of Worms was proclaimed, he had to turn his attention to other affairs. I've mentioned this before, the series of Habsburg-Valois wars. Charles was at war with Francis I, King of France. There was still the issue of the Turk, who presented a threat on the borders, on the let's say the northern and eastern borders of the empire, and had for quite a while now, since the later Middle Ages and on into the 16th century. Um, Even though those are one of the same as I see it, um, it was a problem that we have to prepare for and plan for and figure out how to deal with because it's really an imminent threat. And it really wasn't until the Battle of Mohawks that that threat was put at bay, and that was in 1526. And so Charles had his hands full, so to speak. And you have to remember, too, I've said this several times, he's still only 21 years old. Now, princes, especially at the time, grew up a lot faster than kids do today, so to speak. My oldest son is 24. He's doing great. He's the professional rugby player. Um, but I can't imagine him being an emperor or a king or a president. He's not there yet, and that's nothing against him. I have the highest estimation of his capabilities, not only on the rugby pitch, but also in terms of his perspective on things and his mind. Things have changed. People have changed. Physically, mentally, emotionally, our developments have changed. And so by saying he's 21, Charles, it's not the same as one of you assuming the office of emperor. And yet, he's still only 21. I mean, there is that aspect there too. He was king of Spain already at 16 in 1516. So he certainly had some experience already. But just keep that in mind. He is flustered. He's trying to do a good job. That's one thing about Charles. He's almost a pathetic figure, or a tragic figure, because he's trying his best to do the right thing and keeping with the ideals of his office as a Christian emperor of the empire, a direct ruler for God on earth. And how do we keep all this together when things are coming apart at the seams, it seems? Well, that was nice. I didn't even plan that. Coming apart at the seams, it seems. But I hope you know what I'm meaning there. But first, we have the religious problem. And we keep in mind, too, that religion had always been, going back to pre-Christian times in Rome, going back to ancient Mesopotamia, um, one and the same with politics. It was just an integral part of the state and how the state functioned. There was no question of separation. There was no question of individual choice. It was just a different face of the government, of the state, of the entity, of the body politic that everyone was expected to follow along, with very few exceptions. I mean, the Jews could be Jews during this time, but that was a lot of tension there too, as I've already addressed a bit. But the idea that it was something left to the individual, the idea that it was not a political issue, was unthinkable at the time. So you have that problem going on for Charles. At the same time, you have all these political problems. He's emperor, and how dare Francis I challenge his authority? And as emperor, with these challenges, how was he to deal with the threat of the Turk? So he's, dealing with a lot of problems, and he's still king of Spain, and there's still problems there inherent in the new kingdom of Spain, that the fusion of Castile and Aragon wasn't always a smooth transition, so to speak. So, and they viewed Charles as a foreigner anyway, and so it was real problems throughout his entire realm, basically. And so Charles has to turn his attention to some of these other aspects. And that gave the space for Frederick to be able to protect Luther, and actually for Luther to be able to return to Wittenberg without being captured. It gave space for some of Luther's positions and ideas to catch on and develop and germinate. So there begins to be this faction of evangelicals. That's what they're called, evangelicals. I also think I remember told you they were called the Martinianer, the followers of Luther. But in the early 1520s, it was being formed just as then the Swiss cities start kicking in with Zwingli and the Reformation, and Zurich. Later, then would be Basel, and then a little bit later we'll talk about Geneva. So there are a number of cities who are supporting Luther, even if it's simply against the Italians. Now, what to do about it all? It's a political problem. It's a theological problem. It's a religious problem. It's also an economic problem. Because if you break from Rome, the church, the ecclesiastical hierarchy was the largest landholder in Europe. So what do you do with church property? I know I've talked about this before. What do you do with the parishes? What do you do with the bishoprics and the archbishoprics? Now, the church didn't own the entire bishopric or the entire parish, but certainly significant portions thereof. And is that then just appropriated to the local jurisdiction so that the city gets the land of all the parishes, and the prince gets the land of all the bishops? Whether it be one or a few. What do you do? How do you handle that problem? And then when you're dealing with land and economics and territory, that too is a political problem because the emperor is in charge of it all. So it is a royal mess. I mean, that's not a technical term, but it really was in terms of how to deal with this issue and this problem. And the central focus became, do we enforce the Edict of Worms or not? That was the basis of resistance to the imperial decree, because those territories and princedoms that did not enforce the Edict of Worms, to say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're not going to listen to what the imperial legislature decreed. We're going to say, no, we're not going to enforce it. And that caused then or forced the issue of political entities, whether that be cities or princes at various levels, to make a decision. What do we do? Here we go. The imperial legislature has said this is policy. You must follow it. And if we say no, that could be problematic. That could be really problematic. The highest court had already spoken. There was nowhere further to appeal. That's the tension. And they knew it. And there began to be a significant number of princes and cities, imperial free cities, that decided, no, we are not going to enforce the Edict of Worms. And in that light, when Luther was in those territories, governed or ruled by a city or a prince who was not enforcing the Edict of Worms, he was quote unquote safe. But if he traveled to a city or a territory that was supporting the emperor and the imperial decree, he was subject to being captured and handed over to Rome. So it was a very precarious situation to be in. Luther needed to know precisely who was protecting him and willing to protect him and who wasn't, so slips wouldn't be made. And everyone protecting him was also in trouble, so they needed to be aware of that too. That's the kind of tension that was building up. Now, the attempt to solve the problem was an ongoing one. And this brings me to the second slide, the first Protestants, the deed of spare. Because as I've stressed repeatedly, with Luther, the early followers of Luther, and even what were called the evangelicals, was the evangelical movement, or they were called the Martinianer, or the Lutherani, the Lutherans, the least used term, but it was there. We have to figure this out because we are basically opposing the emperor and opposing imperial policy. We need to try to make our case better. And they did so at a couple of diets, which went nowhere. And actually, they have up here the Diet of Speyer in 1529. There was also a Diet of Speyer in 1526, but Charles was not present for that one. And to keep in mind, that one happened directly after the Peasants' War, which also threw things in chaos and turmoil. Because here we have the peasants, and they're appealing to the gospel. They don't name Luther by name as such. I mean, if you've read the 12 articles, unless I'm forgetting, they don't appeal to Luther as the authority. They appeal to the scriptures as their authority. But were they influenced by Luther's ideas? Oh, yes. And that's one of the reasons why Luther reacted so strongly as he did, because he says they're misunderstanding what my positions actually are. They're abusing what I'm saying, and they're misusing it and using it to evil ends, to rebellion, which is the worst possible thing a subject can do. The devil had rebelled. The devil, Satan, was an angel. He rebelled against God by turning towards himself, thinking of himself, and that was the original fall of the angels. So anyone who rebels is just like Satan. That was the mentality. Now, Diet of Speyer in 1526, nothing was achieved. The Reichstag in session said, no, we're still enforcing the Edict of Worms, and the evangelical princes and cities said, well, we're still not going to enforce the Edict of Worms. And it was a conflict, and then it's like, okay, well, in 3 years, we're going to have a meeting in Speyer again in 1529, and Charles will be there. So this is our opportunity. But actually, Charles wasn't there at the so-called, sometimes it's called the Second Diet of Speyer in 1529. But it was yet again an attempt to solve the conflict. Things weren't so clear in terms of we are now splitting. No, they're still trying to solve the conflict. And the evangelicals are trying to say we need to present our case better. We need to show that we have truth on our side. And the imperial position, or the traditional imperial position, which is also the papal position basically, was that no, this is imperial policy. You cannot contravene imperial policy unless the emperor decree otherwise. You stand still under condemnation and subject to the penalties brought by that. But Charles in 1526 was smack dab in the midst of another phase of the war with Francis. Couldn't really, again, focus on, let's say, the domestic or internal affairs of the empire as such. So there was one last chance and hope, and that was going to be at Augsburg. But something happened at this Diet of Speyer in 1529 that caused, let's say, the line between the parties to widen. And that was when the Reichstag once again came back and said, no, the Edict of Worms must be enforced. And a number of evangelical princes and cities said, no, we protest this decree. And they walked out. They were known from that point on as the Protestant cities and princes. And from Protestant, we get Protestant. They became the Protestants. Those cities and principalities that were protesting the decrees of the imperial legislature of the Reichstag. It was a major event. A major event with one last chance and hope. that they might have some sort of reproachment. And that was going to be at the next Diet, the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. Yet before that, they started strategizing. The evangelicals, the Protestants, the Protestant princes and cities. They said, if we're going to go to Augsburg, once again before the emperor, we have to have our story straight. We have to have our party line be adhered to with uniformity. By this time, there were a number of Swiss cities, Southwest German and Swiss cities, that had also, let's say, joined the movement. Today, we talk about introducing the Reformation. The term was around and being used at the time, but they had, expelled their bishop. They had reformed their church structure, their preaching. They would preach according to the gospel. That was the big calling card, so to speak, of the movement was preaching the pure gospel. We've already talked about the whole concept of sola scriptura and what constituted pure, but that was the idea. So the idea was if we can get all of us together, all of the Protestants within the empire together, to present a united front in Augsburg, we may have a chance. But to do that, we have to get Luther together with the leader of the movement in southwest Germany and Switzerland and the Swiss city-states, Ulrich Zwingli, who had come to the fore as the leader. It seems that they agree on a lot of things, but there's still some differences. So let's just get them together. They'll hash it out. We'll come up with a uniform plan and platform. To do that, Philip Hesse said, okay, I'll provide my castle in Marburg for this discussion. This became known as the Colloquy of Marburg in 1529, bringing Luther and Zwingli together to hash out what differences there might be so that there could be a united Protestant front going into the Imperial Diet of Augsburg in the next year in 1530. Zwingli and Luther agreed about a lot of things. They agreed about passive righteousness and justification. They agreed basically on the Mass, at least in terms that it was not the work of a priest, but of God. I'll get back to that point, though. They agreed on church policy. They agreed on a lot of things, but the one thing they could not agree on was the doctrine of the Eucharist. Tradition has it that when they sat down at the table, because Luther was at Marburg, so was Melanchthon and the whole party, so there was all kinds of discussions going on at all levels, but when it came down to Luther and Zwingli, supposedly Luther took out his knife and carved the words on the table, Hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. And then covered it up with the tablecloth until they got down to the real problem issue of the Eucharist. And when they came to the Eucharist, after achieving unity on basically everything else, more or less, Luther threw back the tablecloth. There were the words. And Luther said, when my Savior says, this is my body, he meant, this is my body. I gnaw on the flesh of my Redeemer. And Zwingli was like, oh, Martin, how can you believe that? The word is, in this context, doesn't mean literally is, it means signifies or symbolizes at most. So this is my body is not saying that the bread is his body. No, it is saying that this ritual meal symbolizes his crucifixion and resurrection. He says, do this in remembrance of me. It is a memory. It is a symbolic ritual. Yes, it is. It's not a cannibalistic physical eating of Christ's body and drinking of his blood. What is wrong with you, Martin? Martin says, no. And Luther's formulation was in, with, and under the elements of bread and wine, when taken in faith, is the true physical body and blood of Christ, which we receive. I stand by the words of Scripture. Unless you can convince me otherwise based on Scripture, good luck. I stand by my interpretation. And Svingen goes, yeah, but your interpretation is wrong. And look what Scripture says. Do this in remembrance of me. It doesn't say, keep eating my flesh and blood and drinking my blood. Luther says, no, this is it. If there was almost any here I stand moment with Luther, and actually there were several, even though not at Worms, when he comes back from the Wartburg and preaches his Invocavit sermons in March of 1522, that's very much a here I stand moment. And then at Marburg, here's a here I stand moment, because he says, I refuse to budge. I believe my words of my Savior and Redeemer. Zwingli can say, I believe them too. Just not as in the way that you believe them. And we just say, yeah, but I'm right. You're wrong. You idiot, you Schwärmer. He almost, he didn't quite go that far, but Schwärmer, Luther used to refer to increasingly to the so-called radicals, who in his view were just all over the place. Like, oh my God, just Schwärmer was like a swarmer. It related to the beehive, and bees were swarming, Schwärmerei. And it's just like undisciplined, unorganized, chaotic, buzzing around. That's how Luther viewed some of the radical reformers. That's how Luther then also viewed Zwingli. And they left Marburg without a unified front. I think I said this before too, but I'll say it again. Martin Butzer, who became the reformer of Strasbourg, very influential figure as well, was at Marburg observing. And Butzer said, future generations will laugh at us when the doctrine that should unite us is the very doctrine that divides us. Now, given that lack of ability to come to a common understanding, there was going to be no united Protestant front against the emperor when they had to go to Augsburg the next year. So what do we do about it? Well, Zwingli and his followers, the southwestern German and Swiss cities, said they would go their own way. And the Martinianer, or Lutherani, the Lutherans, the evangelical faction there, said we'd go our own way. And with the help of Philip Melanchthon, they said, okay, what we have to do, and this is our last hope, what we have to do is present a very concise, clear statement of what we believe, what we stand for, and what we in some ways demand be taken into account and accepted in Augsburg. And so Philip Melanchthon, working with Luther, but he was the major architect and author of, put together a document entitled it The Confession of Augsburg. Now, the Confession of Augsburg, confession, the term is not, oh, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. That was the sacrament of confession. It was not admitting guilt. It was not, yeah, we're wrong. It was very much at this time, as it had been all along, in some way since Augustine wrote his Confessions, an assertion. I confess this to be the case. It's almost the same as what we would today refer to as profess. I profess this to be the case. A confession is to defend a position. That's different from how we understand it. But that was what this document was. It was presenting the Protestant theological and religious position in clear, concise form. You will read the document if you haven't already, because it's part of the assigned readings. I'm pretty sure it is, unless my memory is failing here, but I'm pretty sure the Confession of Augsburg is. I'll have to look again. Anyway, sorry if it's not, my apologies. But you can find it easily, and I'll try to make it available to you since I mentioned it here anyway, if I haven't already. The point being here is that it's an amazing document because this is what became the basis for the Protestant position, not only at Augsburg, but thereafter as well. If you've read, I think it is in chapter 1, but I come back to it later, to Arnoldus Cancrinus and Hildesheim, how Hildesheim finally became Protestant, but not until like 1546 or something like that, when the Schmalkaldic League enforced them to accept Protestantism. And what was that based on? Forcing them to accept the Confession of Augsburg. The introduction of the Reformation in new places, or what's called the Reformation, the introduction of Protestantism, was based on the Confession of Augsburg. So is it a religious document? Yes. Is it a theological document? Yes. It's still one of the foundational theological doctrines of Lutheranism today, along with the Book of Concord, which is 1584 or so, and a lot of other developments, but it's still one of the foundational basis for Lutheranism. Became this religio-political document of the Protestants, of standing, and that meant of being in open rebellion against the emperor. It's a major development and a major document. And the idea was that Augsburg was the last hope for some sort of rapprochement, for some sort of dealing with the situation. Now, I am, my apologies for not remembering. I am pretty certain that I did assign the Confession of Augsburg. I think it's posted in the PDF. So you'll read it. So I'm not going to go through it with you here and now. But do read it. Because it's very much what we think of this as theology, this is religion. What does this have anything to do with politics whatsoever? But the context in which it was written, the context in how it was used, was a completely political, even revolutionary document, because it was the basis of the opposition party over against the emperor, not simply over against the Pope. That was pretty easy to be against the Pope, but to be against the emperor was something else. Now, it was the last hope and chance. And what happens at Augsburg? The Wittenbergers, as they were called, presented their Confession of Augsburg. Luther did not attend, because you can understand that if Luther showed up at an imperial diet, what would happen there? He would have been captured and sent to Rome. But Melanchthon went, and others from Wittenberg did too. Melanchthon presented the document that basically he had constructed, but also the Swiss cities, under the lead of Zwingli, went to Augsburg and presented their own confession, known as the Confession of the Four Cities or the Confessio Tetrapolitana, Confession of the Four Cities. Um, it was, let's see if I can remember them. Zurich, um, Zurich, Mimlingen, um, Basel, maybe. I forget exactly the four cities. I used to know them. My apologies. But Zurich was definitely one of them, a major one of them. And so it's the Swiss position. Now, funnily enough, Zwingli, in his position, became known later on as the Reformed position, or one of the Reformed positions. We talk today about usually the Calvinist tradition is known as the Reformed tradition, but that also includes Zwingli. And there are certainly differences, as we'll talk about later when we get to Calvin a bit. Um, that's very different from the evangelical position of the Lutherans, um, even as both the Swiss Reformed and the evangelical Lutherans um, were all Protestants at this time. And that was based on political opposition to the emperor and the imperial legislature. And when you take that stance, what are the options? The options are one, that you are put down, that the protest is squashed by political forces of the emperor. Or two, there is a quote unquote schism, a break. And that break would lead to war. Because you can't have this. You can't have cities and princes in open rebellion. That cannot be allowed politically, if for no other reason. If I'm the emperor, that cannot be allowed. Number one. Number two, this document they presented, this Confession of Augsburg, is heretical. I am the Christian emperor of Christendom. And for Charles, that term still meant a lot. We can't allow heresy to flourish in the open. We can't allow it to flourish hidden either. We do our best, try to get rid of it, but when it comes out in the open, that's when we have to really crush down. So, what's going to happen? Nothing happened in Augsburg except a stalemate. And the Protestant forces realized they better prepare for war because civil war was coming. Charles was beginning to be able to focus far more than he had previously on the problems within the empire. So we better get our you-know-what together. And they did. And they formed what's been known as the League of Schmalkald, because it was put together in the city of Schmalkald. There's even Schmalkald articles put forward. But the League of Schmalkald was a military defense league consisting of Protestant princes and cities against the emperor. In 1531, when war broke out, it was the League of Schmalkalden against the emperor, and they even eventually formed what was called the Catholic League, a Catholic League of princes and cities loyal to the emperor that were fighting against the League of Schmalkalden. Civil War. Not an issue of toleration. Not even an issue of theology, except for the issue of heresy at the root of it. But if we try to conceive of the developments at this time as being purely religious and for the individual and theological against the people in the wrong, so to speak, we're not going to understand what was going on. because this was a split as fundamental as you can imagine. And we talk a lot about, or have talked a lot about, or we haven't, but there has been a lot of talk in the public discourse about constitutional crises. This was a constitutional crisis for the empire. Now, the empire did not have a constitution like we do, did not have a Supreme Court. The Diet was the Supreme Court as well as the legislature. I just want to try to emphasize the depth of what was going on. Civil War. Civil War. And it will continue till 1555. I think I've mentioned too, by 1555, Charles realized he was not going to achieve a decisive victory. The League of Schmalkalden realized they were not going to achieve a decisive victory. They had won battles. Charles had won battles. The League of Schmalkalden had won battles. But it really wasn't going anywhere. And Charles realized he had failed, especially since the Protestant movement was growing, had grown. Charles was losing on that front. The Peace of Augsburg then said, okay, we're going to stop the fighting. And how we're going to go about doing it is by proclaiming that the religion of the prince, or of the territory, of the city council, will be the religion of that territory, including the city. Whereby Protestant cities could remain Protestant, and Catholic cities would remain Catholic. This was not individual choice except by the princes and city councils. Everyone else simply had to obey or move. It's not toleration. It is begrudging resignation of the reality that now there were two religious confessions or positions within the empire. After proclaiming the Peace of Augsburg, ending the civil wars, Schmalkaldic Wars, Charles abdicated, proclaimed his son Philip II as his heir, and retired to a monastery. Christendom was no more. No longer was there an emperor ruling over all of Christendom, even if it was just the West. And there were two religious beliefs. It'd almost be the same as saying, we're not just going to tolerate the Jews, but we're going to allow the Jews to flourish and have equal standing with us. That still was not the case in 1555. It was only between the Protestants, i.e., the evangelicals, i.e., the Lutherans, and some of the Swiss, Svinglands, and the emperor. It was those who would accept the Confession of Augsburg or not. It was not saying whatever you believe is fine if you believe it. It was not toleration. It was not openness. It was not even acceptance. It was resignation. And that's jumping ahead. I'll probably come back to that. I think I'm pretty sure I will come back to it, I think, in a further lecture. So I'll be repeating some of this again. But that's what we're looking at. And this development from the time of the Edict of Worms to the Confession of Augsburg and the aftermath thereof with the civil wars, the Schmalkaldic Wars, was a period of turmoil. It was a period of anxiety, a period of political scheming and planning, as well as theological debate, and as well as attempts to reform parish life, which we talked about in the last lecture, I think it was, in terms of how do we then go about organizing parishes? How do we go about teaching the people this new position, which itself was an ominous task and did not do very well, as I talked about last time too, in terms of the visitation records. And this whole concept of the failure of the Reformation, I'll come back to, I believe, in next lecture. But for now, that is what we're looking at, the developments after Luther. Luther continued to write, he continued to lecture on the Bible, he continued to have disputations. He dies in 1546. And the movement itself have splinters at that point, even before the Peace of Augsburg. But we'll talk about those developments later. Thank you so much.